Thank you so very much for being here. Welcome to Ebenezer Baptist Church, spiritual home of Martin Luther King Jr., America's Freedom Church. People know the story of Martin Luther King Jr. They know of his commitment to justice. But I'm proud to say that we are a church that has been engaged in the work of building God's kingdom, imbued with love and justice since 1886. Dr. King was a part of a long tradition of justice making. He did not spring out of nowhere. If you lift him up and separate him from the community and the tradition that gave birth to him, you miss the point. Dr. King fought for civil rights and voting rights. People know that in 1965, as a result of his advocacy and those who marched with him, that we got a voting rights law in 1965. Not enough people know that his father, the third pastor of this church, and we've only had 5, I'm the 5th since 1886. His father fought for voting rights here in Atlanta in 1935, when it was much more dangerous, confronting racism in America, in Atlanta, right here in the heart of the South. And his maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, the second pastor of this church, we think of this as the King Church, it's actually the Williams Church. Daddy King got the church pastors in the best way. He married the preacher's daughter. And the rest is history. But A.D. Williams led the movement that created the first high school for colored children in the 1920s. I want you to think about that as we think about race in America. As we think about the hard work and the heavy lift that we're talking about, it hasn't quite been 100 years since black children had a public high school to attend in Atlanta and in the state of Georgia. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our parents sighed. This has been a long, hard road, and the work is still very much in front of us. Are you committed to that work? I'm a black Baptist preacher. You got to talk back to me every now and then. Are you committed to the work? So let me see if I can break down. They gave me 18 minutes, which shows they never came to a black Baptist church. I'm just kidding. And when I say black church, let me say that we have never, ever, in the history of our churches, we've never meant anything racially exclusive about that. I'm talking about the anti-slavery church in America. And it's important that you understand that, because if you don't get that, you really don't understand what gave birth to Martin Luther King Jr. It's powerful as I look out and see the racial parity that's in this room, the fact that we are committed to the work of racial reconciliation. But please understand that in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there was a greater percentage of black people and white people worshiping in the same sanctuary than there is now. Black folk and white folk have worshiped together in the past, late 18th century, early 19th century, in the South. But they worshiped in a segregated situation. They were together, but they weren't equal. You'll understand what I'm trying to get at. Just because you're together, that doesn't mean you're equal. Even communion was segregated. Communion. I mean, I'm here with a bunch of preachers, and so I don't have to break all that down for you, but nothing speaks more to the core and essence of who we are as Christian people than communion. Even communion was segregated, and white people sat in one part of the church, black folks sat in the other part, sat up in the balcony. And so the only reason there's any such thing as historically the black church is because of the depth of our commitment to genuine and authentic human community. That it was a form of resistance that said we refuse to accept segregation in the house of God. And until our white sisters and brothers can catch up to where we are, we'll create our own spaces where we bear witness to the fact every Sunday that all of us are children of the living God. We'll create a space that affirms our own humanity as those created in the image of God. It was the earliest protest among people of African descent in America. And every movement that we've had since then has been based in the church. And so Howard Thurman, that great Christian mystic, you're looking for some books to read, just Google Howard Thurman. He said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. I mean, do I need to run that by you again? By some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. In other words, we weren't simply redeemed by Christianity, we redeemed American Christianity. We took a religion that was intended to make us docile and obedient and transformed it into a liberating faith, because in a Christian slavocracy, talk about an oxymoronic category, they had a problem. If folk became Christians, you might have to liberate them. They were worried about that. And so our churches literally created a theology that separated bodies from souls. Said it's all right, doesn't matter what we do to the body. The issue is that we've liberated the soul, and we're living with the legacy of that right now. The legacy that separates bodies from souls, that engages in a kind of spirituality that refuses to deal with the social and systemic evils that make genuine community actually possible. I talk about this, by the way, in my book, shameless plug, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness. I didn't mean to plug my book, but it's on Amazon.com, $24.95. The Divided Mind of the Black Church. And I speak to that within the context of this particular history, but it is a problem that confronts Christianity in general. And so, as we talk about dealing with this issue of race, when we think about that history, when we think about the fact that black folk had to create their own spaces so that they could worship God in an authentic place, when we think about the fact that we they gave us the Bible and pointed to Ephesians where it says, slaves, obey your masters. And our folk could barely read, and yet they stumbled into Exodus where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. They gave us the blues and we made music. They gave us scraps and we made soul food. We've had to be resilient and creative. And out of that tradition, Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer, don't ever mention the brothers without the sisters, emerged. And that work is still very much with us. And so my church we've been engaged on a whole range of issues, but we've been particularly focused on this issue of mass incarceration. We've been focused on mass incarceration because the United States of America, the land of the free, is the mass incarceration capital of the world. Americans comprise 5% of the world's population, just 5%. We warehouse 25% of the world's prisoners. I want you to think about that. We have not just a greater percentage of our people in prison, but we actually have more people in prison than any other nation in the world. Take all of the regimes whose human rights records we like to deplore and line them all up. We got more people in prison in America and a greater percentage of our population in prison in America than in any other nation in the world. And you say, Reverend, how is that a spiritual issue? Well, somewhere I read where God told Moses, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus saith the Lord, let my people go that they may worship me. Freedom is a spiritual issue. And when you don't recognize that, you end up with something like chattel slavery. Or you end up with Jim Crow segregation. Or you end up being the mass incarceration capital of the world. Most of the people in our prison system are there because of America's war on drugs. Black people and white people, and all of us are entitled to our own opinion, not our own facts. White people and black people use and sell drugs at about the same rate. I know that's hard for some folk to believe, particularly if you get your perception of the world from watching the 6 o'clock news in any city in America, because there's something that drives local news and how it covers the world. But white people and black people use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates, but black people, who are 12% of the population, are over 50% of the prison population, and those people are there because of the war on drugs. At least it was a war as long as it was in places like South Central LA and Detroit and Baltimore. And when the drug was crack, we had a war on drugs. But then, when the drug moved from being crack, are y'all with me? Are y'all asleep? When the drugs moved from being crack and the face is black and urban in rodent-infested places like Baltimore, by the way, they got a whole lot more rats in New York than in Baltimore. I've lived in both places and pastored in both places. I'll leave that alone. But when the drug became opioids and the faces were white and rural and suburban, then all of a sudden we didn't have a war on drugs, we had a public health emergency. Am I making this up? In a war, you have enemy combatants and prisoners of war and militarized weapons of war driving down civilian streets. But when you have a public health emergency, you have clinics and doctors and patients who deserve patience. And so let me be very clear, because my heart bleeds as I see our young people, our sisters and our brothers, our boys and our girls, our children struggling with addiction. And some of you know that heartbreak. I know some of it has hit your own families. And so my heart bleeds, and I'm glad that we're looking at it now as a public health emergency. But now that we've become so enlightened and we're calling it a public health emergency, what I want to know is who's going to restore the black and brown communities that have been decimated and devastated by the war on drugs. I mean, folks, there cannot be racial reconciliation without racial justice. Don't ever allow anybody to talk to you about racial reconciliation without talking about racial justice. There cannot be fellowship. You can't have any kind of relationship without some truth telling. Raise your hand if you're married. I mean, you can't have any kind of authentic relationship if there's no space to tell the truth. So now we have a public health emergency. And now I know I'm talking to a bunch of preachers, and some of you may not be where I am on some of these issues, but now we're talking about the decriminalization of marijuana. And now people are becoming billionaires through the marijuana industry. You tell me if you think it's just for some people to be billionaires while other people are locked up right now for having sold the same substance. So when you talk about what happened to Baltimore, let me tell you what happened to Baltimore, and I can't let it go too easily because I pastored there for 5 years. And I pastored in New York City as well. Baltimore, a southern city, is the product of decades of racial oppression, and then on top of that, then a war. Do you remember what we did after we waged war in Europe? We had a Marshall Plan to restore the cities of Europe. Baltimore isn't just devastated, the federal government helped to devastate Baltimore. And so the question is going to be 50 years from now, where were we when all of this was going on? Did the church stand up? Did it speak the truth? This is the church of Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King wrote a famous letter called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And in it, one of the things that he says, pastors, over and over again, go back and read it. He says, I am deeply disappointed, he said, in the church. I just want to read this. He said, on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward, and I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Listen, where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with the words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest. He said, where was the church when Governor Wallace of Alabama gave the clarion call for defiance and hatred? I wouldn't be telling you the truth if I didn't lift up the fact that just this week, the daughter of Governor Wallace, reflecting on the vitriol that's coming from the highest office in our land, said that she's never heard anything like this. I'm just telling you what she said. She said that what she's hearing right now is worse than what came from the lips of Governor Wallace. The question is, and the question will be 50 years from now, what was the church saying? What was the church saying and doing while all of this was unfolding before our very eyes? Part of how you know you are part of an oppressed community is you find yourself having to have a movement or a slogan or a campaign to declare about yourself that which other folk can just wake up in the morning and take for granted. And so Dr. King went to Memphis fighting for sanitation workers. And two of those sanitation workers, Robert Walker and Echo Cole, were literally crushed in the machinery and the incinerator of their trash trucks. I'm going somewhere. And that's when he made his way to Memphis. They literally, their bodies were crushed. And I want you to think about the fact that this was 1968. The Civil Rights Bill had already been passed. The Voting Rights Bill had already been passed. Their bodies were crushed. Why were their bodies crushed in the incinerator of their trash truck? Because there was a rainstorm and their white counterparts could get inside the truck, but they weren't allowed to be inside the truck. And so they were seeking shelter from the rainstorm, but there was no shelter from the rain and the storm of racism in America, and they were literally crushed. And Dr. King, who was busy planning the Poor People's Campaign, in America, we criminalize the poor. That's part of what's going on with our mass incarceration system. We put people in jail for days, for weeks, for months, waiting on trial, not because they're dangerous, but because they can't afford to pay the bond. And so our church spent Father's Day weekend bailing poor people out of jail. And saying that we ought to get rid of cash bail altogether. So Dr. King made his way to Memphis. And you remember the Memphis movement. And that was his last stand. And there emerged out of that movement those signs that are now iconic, simple and sublime, powerful, and very basic. They said, I am a man. I am a man. When you're part of an oppressed community, you have to have a campaign and a movement to declare about yourself that which ought to be obvious. I am a man. Sojourner Truth, ain't I a woman? Dealing with racism and sexism. And lately, Black Lives Matter. If your response to that is, don't all lives matter? The answer is yes, that's exactly what we mean. You told me to just talk. That's exactly what we mean. That's exactly what we mean when we say Black Lives. Why would a person have to say, I am a man? Because you live in a society where the obvious ain't obvious. And so for the folks, they asked me a little while ago, I went on CNN because there was a preacher who said, Dr. King would be horrified by this slogan of Black Lives Matter. Dr. King would be against that. And so they asked me, because I'm the pastor of Dr. King's church, what do you think about that? So I went on cable television and I said, well, you really don't have to look that far. You ought to look at the I Have a Dream speech. I get tired of that speech because that's the only speech people quote. But even in that speech, if you look at that speech, Dr. King said, when will they be satisfied? He said, as long as the Negro, he said, as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality, we will not be satisfied. It's in the I Have a Dream speech. Dr. King speaking to the issue of police brutality in 1963, that's how long we've been dealing with this and longer, and saying not just brutality in general, as long as the Negro, he said, is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality, we will not be. That is the 1960s version of saying Black Lives Matter. Let me see if I can, I'm talking to preachers, we paint pictures. It's like if there's a fire, somebody's house is on fire, and the fire department arrives. Thank God they're finally here. And instead of spraying the house that's on fire, they spray all the houses on the street because all houses matter. Eric Garner saying, I Can't Breathe, Rekia Boyd, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, these are names that folk in we know, and the list goes on and on. Trayvon Martin, they're all emblematic of an American house that's on fire. And the question is, what will the church do? Police brutality is an expression of this larger issue of mass incarceration and racism in America. And the judgment of God is upon the church. And the question is, will the church be the church? Can I tell you a secret, something that I know better than anybody in this room, even those who lived through the movement? Great respect for you, Dr. Perkins. What I know as the pastor of this church better than anybody in this room is that every black person in America, every single one, over 65, marched with Dr. King. In fact, all of them were right there, right next to him. Why is that? And they all tell me their stories. In fact, there aren't enough streets in America just for the black people who march with Dr. King, let alone our white and Jewish sisters and brothers. Why is that? It's because when people who lived through that period take stock of their witness during that time, it's not that you have to have, I'm not saying that you ought to be ashamed of yourself if you didn't march. There are all kinds of ways. But what's going on is people are taking stock of their witness because they realize in retrospect, as Dr. King used to say, that they slept through a revolution. And I'm saying to you that white supremacy is a virus that mutates. And over this 400 years, it has mutated and has proven to be incredibly resilient. So you had slavery, and then you had re-enslavement through Jim Crow segregation. Douglas Blackman talks about that in his book. In some ways, Jim Crow segregation was worse than slavery. And then mass incarceration and the logic that informs it is the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander describes it. And even for black folk who don't end up in jail, it impacts all of us. Say, oh, just follow the rules. Well, what if you follow all the rules and you end up at Yale University as a student and you can't sleep in your own dormitory without the police knocking on your door, forcing you to prove that you belong here? It's the twisted logic of mass incarceration. And so our church has been engaged in this work. We've been expunging criminal arrest records. We had a day here one Saturday when literally we called together the judges, the defense attorneys, the district attorney, the GBI, the clerks. They all came together, and one Saturday in our banquet hall, we were expunging criminal arrest records. Because all across our county and your county, there are people who've never been convicted of anything, but they can't get housing, they can't get an apartment, they can't get a job because the application asks, have you ever been arrested? Not have you ever been convicted, but have you ever been arrested? Can I tell you, in communities that I know about, it's not that hard to get arrested. And they can't get a job because they've been arrested. And so it was one of the most powerful moments in my ministry. I walked in this sanctuary one Saturday, and hundreds of folk were here, and everybody in church that day had a record. Now that I think about it, that's true every Sunday. That'll preach. I know some of you are looking for something for Sunday. That's true every Sunday. We all have a record, and none of us wants to be judged by our worst day. And so we were clearing criminal arrest records, and now we're teaching others how to do it. If you want to learn more about that, go to our website, endingmassincarceration.com. Not the church website, endingmassincarceration.com. Let me tell you a quick story, and I'm gone. After we did that expungement event at our church, a few months later, I was sitting in the barbershop. True story, believe it or not. I was sitting in the barbershop. You laughing too much. I was sitting in the barbershop. I go there for tonsorial follicular therapy. And this gentleman said to me, "Pastor, that was a great event you had at your church." I said, "What?" He said, "The expungement event." I said, "Wow, thank you." He said, "No, you don't understand." He could tell I was just a general thank you. He said, "You don't get it." He said, "Pastor, that day you expunged my record." Now, he was well dressed, had on a jacket like you. You know, he looked respectable. Huh? He said, you expunged my record. And he said 20 years ago, he had something about a bad check. Something about a bad check and an ex-wife. I didn't need to know the details, whatever. And he said, for 20 years, you've never been convicted. For 20 years, I've been living under the shadow of this. We're the most punitive nation in the world. And I say that from a place of deep love. Don't tell me love it or leave it. No, love it. If you love something, you criticize it. If you love something, you challenge it to be its very best. Isn't that why you chastise your children? Because you love them. Said, you expunged my record. I said, "God bless you, brother. I was trying to get out of there." He said, "Wait a minute, Rev." He said, "As a result of that, I've been able to get a better job. I had a job, but I was never able to get a job commensurate with my skills. But because you cleared my record, I got a better job. My income has gone up. My whole quality of life has improved." I said, "God bless you, brother." He said, "Wait a minute, Rev." He said, a little while ago, there was a couple in my family, and they had a baby that they weren't able to take care of. And that child was about to go into the foster care system. Thank God for foster care parents, but if you look at the data, very often the outcomes are not good. And if they put, at 18 you age out, think about the 18-year-olds in your family. If you let them loose with nothing after that, usually the outcome isn't that good, usually. It's part of the pipeline. He said, a while ago when I had that record, I wouldn't have been able to help, but because you cleared my record, I was able to adopt my own family member. Take them into my house. 2 generations changed because we cleared one record. And so I'm gone, but I want us to have honest talk. I want us to recognize that there can be no true racial reconciliation without a deep commitment to racial justice. I want us to recognize that there can be no fellowship without truth-telling. And that God has called us to this work. And our children and our grandchildren are going to ask us, what were we doing? Did we stand up? Did we speak truth to power? Were we on the right side? And so I trust and pray that you'll do this work and that you'll recognize the ways in which blackness and brown skin and criminality, that's how that's working in this moment. And it is so deep that it defies analysis. Even when the facts don't line up, it doesn't matter because it's a gut thing that people have. And that's the trick that's being played right now. I'm not being partisan, I'm just telling the truth. That's the trick. And it's not just at every level. It's been going on for at least 40 years. This whole thing that connects black and brown people and fear and criminality is deep, deep, deep in the culture. And it's poisoning the atmosphere. But we have the tools to do battle. We have the tools to stand up for righteousness and truth and justice, and we do it by recognizing that the God we serve, that the God who stood up in Christ has a record of using people with a record. Moses told Pharaoh to let my people go. And so we know Moses as lawgiver and liberator, but don't forget that Moses had a rap sheet. That before he was lawgiver and liberator, Moses actually murdered a man. Joseph had a record. Long before the Central Park 5, there was Potiphar's wife who falsely accused him. He ended up in prison. 3 Hebrew boys stood up in a moment of civil disobedience. They had a record. Daniel had a record because he refused to do what the king told him to do. God has a history of using folk with a record. There was a brother named John who had a record. And they put him on an island, a lonely island called Patmos. It was the Rikers Island of that day. But while he was on that lonely island, he had a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. Oh, I almost forgot. Jesus had a record. And we ought not be surprised. I mean, of course he had a record. After all, I mean, look at the neighborhood he came from. Brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, born in a barrio called Bethlehem, raised in a ghetto called Nazareth. And when an insecure despot was concerned about his power and threatened all of the babies, his parents smuggled him as an undocumented immigrant into Egypt. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. And maybe that's why when a caravan of immigrants confronted him in the desert, about 5,000 of them, he fed them. And when the sick were sick and could not get any help, he healed them and never asked them if they had a pre-existing condition. And for that, they brought him up on trumped-up charges. And one dark Friday, they executed him on a Roman cross, the instrument of execution in that day. And he stayed there. They put him in a borrowed tomb. He stayed there all day Friday, all day Saturday. Stayed there Saturday night, but early Sunday morning, he got up to prove that truth crushed to earth will rise again.